Good evening, everybody. My name is Justin Zaremby, and on behalf of the Activities Committee, I want to welcome you all to this evening, and I want to especially thank Peter Cole for being willing to spend some time with us tonight. Peter has been affiliated with Yale since 2006. I have the honor to have been the person to greet him and his wife Adina at the gates of what was then called Calhoun College, where they were fellows, and I think around 2 a.m. after they had landed from Israel. And they've become such an important part of the Yale community. And I think at this moment, more than any other moment, it's so special to have people like Peter and Adina, who's joining us tonight, as part of our community and the larger Yale Club community. Peter is a senior lecturer in Judaic studies and comparative literature, and he's the author of 5 books of poems and I would say countless volumes of translation of poetry from Hebrew and Arabic. He has received numerous awards for his work, including fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Guggenheim Foundation. He's won a Penn Translation Award, a TLS Translation Prize, awards from the American Library Association. I could go on and on and on, but that will take away time from reading poetry. I will say he has recently published a volume of new and selected poems and translations with Farrar, Straus, and Giroux called Hymns and Qualms, and I would encourage everyone to go out and get it, or I guess now have it delivered to you as quickly as possible. And I think the way this is going to work tonight is Peter is going to start off and do some readings for us, and he and I are going to have a bit of a conversation. And if people have questions, if they can put it in the chat box, we can build those into the conversation. And we have a really lovely group of, it looks like 23 people tonight. So later on in the conversation, we may be able to open this up for questions as well. I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to ask Peter to start reading.
Thank you, Justin. I do remember rolling out of that car and meeting you a long time ago. Hello, everybody. It's nice to be with you on this strange context. So I picked a group of poems tonight that in some way addresses our moment, the moment of pandemic, the sort of, I think of it as the coronal moment. And Justin and I will talk about those and what makes them relevant to what we're all going through. But I thought I would just jump in with poems. So some of the poems, I should say, some of them are my own poems, and some of them are poems that I've translated, and we'll go into all that in some detail. But I want to just start with a short poem with a long backstory, and maybe, Justin, we can get into some of that backstory afterwards. The poem's called Every Single Person. Every single person you meet, Philo wrote, it said, everyone is fighting a very great battle, except that no one is able to find where he said it, or what he thought the burden might be that brings it on. Still, it's almost certainly true. And so he added, perhaps, be kind. So that was a poem that had a kind of Yale genesis in a conversation with Sherwin Shep Newland, who many of you probably know as the author of How We Die, a bestseller among his other books. And we can talk a little bit about maybe how that came to be. But it seemed to me a poem that very much was written in a very different context, but it seemed very much to apply to our situation as I walk around New Haven, as we Zoom, as I deal with students every day. That sense of everybody you encounter is going through something, much greater than what you understand, but something that you can certainly identify with and relate to. But I was also struck about the poem that, or about the line of Philo's, that we don't actually know if he said it. And, the sense of that when something is passed down as a classic statement by a classic philosopher. Philo was a Greek philosopher, a Greek Jewish philosopher from around the turn of the millennium. What's the authority of that? Is kindness, in fact, what's called for in this situation? Not everybody responds in that way. I know, Justin, if you wanted to say anything about that.
I was focused on that as well. This question of, does it matter whether Philo said it? Because
Right.
the poet, there seems to be the sense that it doesn't matter, that hearsay is enough.
Well, so the way the thing that triggered this poem was, I was sitting in a car with Shep Newland. He had invited my wife and I to come give a talk at his synagogue, actually near New Haven. And we were talking, in fact, about a dear mutual friend of ours, Justin Maria Rosa Menokal, and who was very sick with cancer, and was, at that time, we didn't know exactly what it was, but Shep made it very clear to me that there was very little chance that she would recover. And we were sitting in the car talking about this. And I think on the way, maybe it was the way back from this event, when he drove us home, I asked him what he was working on now. And he said, oh, I'm working on a book about things that are attributed to very famous people and that have had a tremendous influence in the world and in people's thought, but for which there actually is no textual evidence that they ever said it. This is very, so a classic example is Freud saying that, the purpose of psychoanalysis is so that you'll be able to love and work. I can't tell you how many times I've thought about that thing, whatever it is that whatever form of therapy or whatever work one does on oneself, one of the sort of more believable goals is to be able to love and to work. And apparently Freud never said that. Another obvious thing is, or relevant to me, is Robert Frost. Poetry is what's lost in translation. Again, he never wrote that anywhere. It was rumored to have said it, but almost everybody who talks about translation mentions that at some point. So Philo, probably the most famous thing that he's credited with is this line, which I tweet a little bit, but that everybody you meet is fighting a very great battle. Right? Therefore, be kind. And it comes down as the kind of wisdom of the ages. But who knows? And who knows if that's the truth? Who knows if that's the best way to react? Maybe the best way to react is look out for yourself. Or, there are a lot of other responses to a kind of situation like ours, other than be kind, as we've seen. So yeah, I guess what I wanted there with a poem like that was to get at the precariousness of that knowledge, the fragility of it, that, we walk around with all kinds of ideas about the world and truths that are things that are meaningful for us, and yet they're the most sort of it's the most fragile kind of knowledge, and yet it's the most powerful kind of knowledge. I mean, that kind of knowledge that Philo has, every single person you meet is fighting a very great battle. Therefore, be kind is a transformative kind of knowledge. That we don't know who said it, that it's all a kind of fabrication, is also something that sort of adds to the poignancy of it, and seems very much about our moment too, when we really don't know what's going to happen next. So the next poem I wanted to read was really follows out a similar kind of line of thought. It's called The Song of the Shattering Vessels. And goes like this. Either the world is coming together, or else the world is falling apart. Here, now, along these letters, against the walls of every heart. Today, tomorrow, within its weather, the end or beginning's about to start. The world impossibly coming together, or very possibly falling apart. Now the lovers' mouths are open. Maybe the miracle's about to start. The world within us coming together, because all around us, it's falling apart. Even as they speak, he wonders. Even as the fear departs, is that the world coming together? Can they keep it from falling apart? The image gradually is growing sharper. Now the sound is like a dart. It seemed their world was coming together, but in fact, it was falling apart. That's the nightmare. That's the terror. That's the Isaac of this art, which sees that the world might come together if only we're willing to take it apart. The dream, the lure isn't an answer that might be plotted along some chart, as we know the world that's coming together within our knowings, falling apart. So that one is a kind of, I suppose there's something slightly immodest or indecent about thinking of one's own poems walking around, but that's, one gets the sense these days that that's very much the case. So.
Peter, why did you write that as a song with the repetition and the meters and rhyme structured as you did?
I mean, the short answer is I have no idea at some basic level why one chooses to do something like that. Poems come from, there's a certain given. I remember, I think I started this poem on a traffic island on the Upper West Side while I was crossing the street, and a not particularly good frame of mind years ago. And I guess what I was trying to get at there was a sense of systole and diastole. Things are, that's a very organic rhythm, the way the heart works, the way the lungs work, the way everything works, the way relationships work, the way now as we walk around in this, in this moment, in this situation, this kind of quarantine or lockdown or whatever it is, the fact that all these things have been taken away from us, these very, very basic things, the basic structure and order of our day, gives us a sense of what that order is all about, how it's made. We become sort of more attuned, more aware of the connections in all of that. And that's a kind of mythic pulse, right? That's not something that happens, oh, now you're feeling this way, now it's all better. No. These are things that are happening all the time inside every relationship we have, whether it's a relationship with other people, relationship with language, relationship with ourselves, relationship with text. And I wanted to get at that mythic pulse, which is a pulse of return, right? Eliade would say eternal return. So that sense of these, you recognize this situation, you come to some kind of acknowledgement of it, and some sort of, you cope with it, but then it comes back. And when it comes back with a difference. And that difference requires new response. And I mean, that seems to me very much a kind of situation we're in now, where we're brought back to very, very basic things almost daily, the way we listen to press conferences or we read things and we look for the news, but we're brought back to the most basic things, and then we expand out from them, and then we come back to them. So, probably when I was doing it, I was working on sheer impulse, but intellectually behind it, artistically, that's probably the thought that's behind it. I mean, there's a lot of other thought that's behind it too, but we don't need to go into all that.
We've got a couple people who've actually been posting comments, Peter, and they suggested actually that there's a resonance here with Eliot's four quartets in the repetition of time present and time past, this concept of coming together and coming apart. I always hate to ask a poet if, who they think may have influenced them, if anyone, because we hear lots of voices all the time in our heads, but I don't know if you want to comment on that.
I'm happy to comment on that. I mean, I love Eliot. I wouldn't say that's a direct somebody I was thinking of here, but that mythic quality that he gets is certainly something that's mattered to me in Eliot. It matters to me, period, in poetry. And I'm also someone who very much, so my dear friend was Harold Bloom, The Anxiety of Influence, but I'm very much about the pleasures of influence and the kind of, bring it on, and, or what he called later on the anatomy of influence. So there's a kind of channeling that I think is part of the poet's work. And that gives me great pleasure as a writer. So, not Eliot consciously. I did come across something by T.S. Eliot in my reading in the last couple of days that really struck me that I had never noticed before. It's in Tradition and the Individual Talent, one of his most famous essays, where he says that, as he put, I'm paraphrasing, but that poems involve the kind of coalescence of a great many experiences that people of action in the world, or people of action and the sort of average person wouldn't even acknowledge as experience at all. In other words, it's never one thing that goes into a poem, that there's a kind of synthesis that takes place, and it's a synthesis of a kind of internal experience. And so I think that's very much something that I relate to, and that's happening here. I also saw I couldn't read the chats as they're flying up, but I saw an Elizabeth Bishop comment about the Villanelle, but so that is very much, this particular form is not a given form. It's a form I made up to account for that kind of return that I wanted. But I've also written in villanelles and like that principle of return. And always, Edgar Pound said that, whenever poetry gets too far from song, it's usually beginning to enter a period of decadence. And somewhat unfashionably, I like song and poetry. I feel that that's one of, everybody says you can't live without stories. And I said, wait a second, I can't live without music, So I want the music of words to be front and center in the poem.
Peter, before you go on
yeah.
to the next poem, I did have one more question, which is, there was a beautiful stanza where you made reference to Isaac. I was wondering if you could read that stanza again and then maybe talk a bit about that.
That's the nightmare, that's the terror, that's the Isaac of this art, which sees that the world might come together if only we're willing to take it apart. I probably get asked more about that stanza, that image of the Isaac of this art, and I have no idea. That just came to me in the course of writing. It's strange. This poem, I wrote about half of it right away on that traffic island. And then it sort of sat in my drawer for a long time, and I would go back to it and look at it and add a little bit and take away. And I kept bringing it out every once in a while. I would show it to my wife, and she would nod. And then at a certain point, she said, wow, how did that happen? It kind of grew into something, but it took a long time. And that Isaac, so the Isaac of this art, I've always, in a lot of my poetry, I'm very, and in my translation, I'm very concerned, interested in sacrifice, ideas of sacrifice. Lionel Trilling says all life is sacrifice. In some way, it doesn't have to all be bloody and dismemberment, but there's always a sense of displacement and replacement and moving on. That's a kind of sacrifice. And the story of Isaac is this kind of ultimate risk for some absolute value. And I do think of poetry in that very serious and kind of highfalutin way. So that's probably what was in there, but believe me, Justin, I just wrote it in a kind of trance and trusted it. So, yeah. Let me move on to, since I mentioned translation, I want to read, I go back in time and then to some older poetry, and then older but very modern and utterly relevant poetry, and then move back up into more modern poetry. One of my favorite poets of all time is a man named Shmuel or Samuel Hanagid, who was he was the most powerful Jew in Muslim Spain in the 11th century. So we're talking about Islamic Spain. For those of you, I would assume most of you don't know anything about that period. Think of the Alhambra, basically, right? The presence of Near Eastern power, Islamic art, Islamic philosophy, Islamic science, very, very advanced culture. Uh, in at the far ends, the far western ends of Europe, edge of Europe, in Spain, in the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, while most of Europe is really in a dark age. And this was an incredible man, total polymath, who, in addition to being the sort of head of the Jewish community in all of Spain, you can think of him as the head of the UJA of Spain or something, was also a major legal scholar, a Talmudist. He was also a major politician in the Muslim government, who eventually rose to the ranks of Prime Minister of Granada, the city-state of Granada. So he was essentially the governor or Prime Minister of a kind of small country inside the Spain was broken up into all these different city-states. And he was also the head of the Islamic army of Granada for many, many years. And Granada was a powerful city-state. So you had this very unlikely man rising to an unlikely position. And on top of that, he's, to my mind, one of the greatest Jewish Hebrew poets of all time. I think his poetry is as good as anything in the Bible. I think it's as good as anything that's ever been written. So that ups the stakes a little bit for a little poem I'm going to read. I'll read 2 poems of his. But this is an epigram from a book of his that he called After Ecclesiastes. And he's interested in sort of the wisdom tradition and the epigrammatic tradition. And in a way, if you're looking for influences, the first poem I read, Every Single Person, it's a kind of spin-off in some ways of the poem I'm going to read. So I gave this poem the title, Multiple Troubles. Again, picking this for our moment. The multiple troubles of man, my brother, like slander and pain, amaze you? Consider the heart, which holds them all in strangeness and doesn't break. The multiple troubles of man, my brother, like slander and pain, amaze you? Consider the heart, which holds them all in strangeness and doesn't break. And what he's trying to do there, in a way, is update the tradition of Ecclesiastes, the book of Ecclesiastes, that kind of wisdom tradition. He's doing it by writing in a Hebrew that's heavily influenced by Arabic literature, that the meters are taken from Arabic, the rhyme is taken from Arabic, everything. But the language itself is a kind of pure biblical Hebrew. So this is the unlikely graft. Another poem of, I can see that Sylvia's asking, can I spell the Hebrew poet's name? So his first name is Shmuel, Samuel. Now, his last name is not actually his last name. He goes by his title, Ha-Nagid, H-A-N-A-G-I-D, Shmuel Ha-Nagid. And Ha-Nagid means the governor. So he became known as Samuel the governor, or Samuel the prince. And that's the way all of his poetry. His actual name was, there you go, Justin, thank you. His actual name was, his last name was Nagrela. These people, these Jewish poets all spoke Arabic as their mother tongue. They lived in Arabic. So his name was actually Ismail ibn Nagrela. And he was dark, and he was essentially, you would identify him as an Arab. And Arabic was, as I say, his mother tongue, but they knew Hebrew from the age of 3. It was very, very deep in them. So I'll read one more poem by him just because I like him so much. This is a poem called The Market. And, so now we're not allowed to go to these kind of markets. We can't go to the supermarket, or we go to the supermarket, we go with arrows down the aisles and, quotas and how many people can enter at once. But again, and the shelves are sometimes bare in certain cases, and you're hoping that what you want is there, which brings up questions of supply line. Like supply lines are very, when you hear the people on the radio or the TV talking about supply lines, this is a very fragile, the whole world can collapse because of supply lines, right? This is an essential thing, the kind of arteries of commerce. And poetry is the same, and it was the same in the 10th century, and it was probably the same in the time of Christ. And so he writes a poem about what is it like to walk through a medieval, a 10th century this case would be 11th century market in Granada, to have your eye and your mind take in everything all around you and then sort of make sense of it. Again, you make sense of these things when they're most threatened, but poets are always feeling that kind of threat, right? That sense that things are coming together, falling apart. So this is just a normal day in the market, and yet he's looking at it as we might look at it today. And I should say that the last line in the poem is taken directly from the book of Ecclesiastes, but has a whole different meaning. He gives it a different meaning. The market. I crossed through a market where butchers hung oxen and sheep side by side. There were birds and herds of fatlings like squid, their terror loud as blood congealed over blood and slaughterers' knives over vein. In booths alongside them the fishmongers, and fish in heaps and tackle like sand, and beside them the street of the bakers, whose ovens are fired through dawn. They bake, they eat, they lead their prey, they split what's left to bring home. And my heart understood how it happened and asked, who are you to survive? What separates you from these beasts, which were born and knew waking and labor and rest? If they hadn't been given by God for your meals, they'd be free. If he wanted this instant, he'd easily put you in their place. They've breath like you and hearts which scatter them over the earth. There was never a time when the living didn't die, nor the young that they bear not give birth. Pay attention to this, you pure ones and princes, so calm in your fame. Know if you'd fathom the worlds of the hidden. This is the whole of man.
Peter, that concept of the whole of the hidden.
One more time, Justin, you broke up on me there.
The concept of the worlds of the hidden.
Yes.
I've noticed, and I've read articles, I think a lot of people are noticing for the first time in a while, the sound of birds.
Right.
Something we don't really think about and often are pests, but I will say, walking the streets of New Haven lately, I've been shocked at the cries of songbirds in ways that I've never noticed before.
Right. Yeah. Well, so this is a kind of classic role of the poet. I think while we were talking before the event tonight, Justin, you were asking me about, why poetry now? And I've noticed that a lot of people, a lot of my colleagues at Yale, people in the administration, people are turning to poetry in ways that, you kind of wish they would all the time, but everybody's busy. And but there is something like, now that the distractions have been stripped away and some of the frills and the endless, racing from place to place, and the cars are a little bit off the street and all that. So yeah, you start to hear the birds, you start to notice things. When you walk through we live in Worcester Square, you walk through the park and there's the neighbor playing catch with his kid at our alderman or whatever, our state representative playing catch with his kid at 1 o'clock. And suddenly you notice these things with a different kind of heightened sort of consciousness. I'd like to think that that's what poets are doing all the time, which is also one of the reasons they don't necessarily fit in under normal circumstances. But yeah, so the worlds of the hidden are not necessarily esoteric worlds. The worlds that are there under the surface all the time. And of course, even people who deal with esoteric, mystical things would say, well, yeah, those esoteric things are also not far away. They're also right under your nose. But yeah, that combination of, what's the worlds of the hidden in this poem? It's how the laws of commerce are a microcosm of a kind of macrocosmic understanding of the way the larger order works, that these things are interconnected, that he's not saying, become a vegan, right? He's not saying don't eat these creatures. He's saying understand how they're all connected, where they come from, how you are one of these creatures, where you come from, where you're going. It doesn't tell you what to do, but it does say be aware of it in a different way. So it's very much like those birds. Maybe that's a good segue to, I want to jump back into the 20th century, since those two poems were a kind of synthesis of Islamic, Arabic, and Hebrew things. Um, one of the more delightful surprises in my life as a literary person was encountering 20 years ago a Palestinian poet in Israel, where I live half the year, a Palestinian poet named Taha Muhammad Ali. And maybe just for to get the picture, as it were, I will hold up a picture of his face. Let's see if I can get it into the. Can you all see that? Yeah. All right. So he's got quite a striking face, and he was a very striking individual. No longer with us. Totally delightful person. A peasant, Palestinian peasant who grew up in a farming village near Nazareth. That at the beginning he born in the 30s, but it was really kind of 18th century farming village at that point. It was a completely, there was no electricity, there was no running water, that's the way he grew up. The village was destroyed in 1948 in the war, and he fled to Lebanon, and he came back and he lived in Nazareth for the rest of his life, where he worked as selling souvenirs at a shop near the Church of the Annunciation in Nazareth. He was a trinket salesman his entire life, taught himself classical Arabic because he only had 4 years of schooling, taught himself English, and gradually was writing poetry, and late in life actually came to a kind of real prominence in world literature. And traveling around the world with him was really an amazing thing. So I want to read a couple of poems by him, which also, so one of the things that struck me about our lockdown moment is, as I say this, how it returns you to a sense of the basics. That as soon as there's a constraint, as soon as you're deprived of something, you begin to notice it more and think more about it, whether it's your meals or your friends or your significant others or you name it, right? You begin to miss it as soon as even the threat of it's being taken away, you become aware of it. So Taha's got a couple of poems that I think deal with this kind of essential quality of consciousness. They're collected in a small group of poems called Twigs. In other words, these very fragile, delicate kind of perceptions. One of them goes like this. And so it has taken me all of 60 years to understand that water is the finest drink, and bread the most delicious food, and that art is worthless unless it plants a measure of splendor in people's hearts. And so it has taken me all of 60 years to understand that water is the finest drink and bread the most delicious food, and that art is worthless unless it plants a measure of splendor in people's hearts, right? A very, very simple poem. At one point we were traveling around somewhere and I realized that I had screwed up the airline schedule and that his son was going to pick him up from the airport back in Israel, and I'd given him the wrong day. I had counted for when we were leaving, the time difference between the States and Israel. And I apologized to him. I said, I screwed up, sorry. And he looked at me and he said, the peasant too has a computer. He knew what he was doing. Here's another poem of his in the same series. And this is a poem, I should say, that when Yitzhak Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel, was assassinated, and there, a short time after that, maybe a month after that, there was an enormous rally in Tel Aviv in his memory, honor, a kind of sort of national rallying of some sort. The host of the entire gathering, and there must have been 100,000 people there. The host is a guy who was like a TV talk show host. He's now a politician. But he but at prime time, he read this poem by this Palestinian poet to the entire country, which was quite a moment. And this was the poem. After we die, and the weary heart has lowered its final eyelid on all that we've done, and on all that we've longed for, on all that we've dreamt of, all we've desired or felt, hate will be the first thing to putrefy within us. So, that's the maybe I'll switch gears. I don't know if anybody has any questions, if you want to ask anything, or Justin, if you want to ask, I'll.
Well, I did want to ask a bit about that, the contrast in the first of the two poems you read, where we get these very basic things that are the finest things. Water is the finest drink. Bread is the most delicious food. And then you have this idea of the splendor that art has to provide. And in this particular moment, I think there's a little bit of guilt that people have about any concept of splendor. And part of that is because we're all spending our time in the office, actually in our living room, wearing sweatpants to meetings, but also because there's a level of guilt that comes with splendor, particularly when people are suffering. I'm fascinated by that contrast between the splendor of art and the simplicity of.
Well, there's, the movie Sullivan's Travels. The notion that people often have a feeling that, in difficult times, one has to, produce something very serious. This had to do with the movie, had to do, I think, if I remember right, Adina will chat and correct me. She's a film critic, but prisoners are in a jail or are going to put on something, and the question is, what's going to, what kind of movie do they want to? Adina, what's going on there? You're laughing. Have I gotten it wrong? Can't hear you.
Basically, I can't see myself, so I don't know how I'm sounding, but there is a very, like a guy who has made a bunch of movies called things like Ants in Your Pants of 1936, and he decides that because the Great Depression has struck, it now behooves him to make a movie called Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And so he goes and turns himself into a hobo and travels the rails, and it's very horrible, and he sees how everybody else is living, and at a certain point he gets arrested and put on a chain gang, and at the end of this very hard day of terrible work, he suddenly realizes that they're given an evening of a movie and they watch these cartoons. It's not exactly Bugs Bunny, but it's the equivalent, and he sees them laughing their heads off, and he understands that what the world needs when they've just spent all day on a chain gang is Bugs Bunny, basically.
Yeah.
That his idea of making a serious movie about, oh brother, where art thou, is not what they need. They need to be relieved of their burdens for a few minutes.
Yeah, and this goes back to a kind of classic role of art. Chaucer says, the purpose of poetry is twofold. It's to provide sentence and solace. Sentence meaning instruction, solace meaning comfort, but also entertainment. And he says that in the Canterbury Tales, which is, nothing if not entertaining, and has actually plague things, right? He has people doing less than honorable things in the time of plague. But it's, that's part of the song part of this whole thing, is also song is partly solace and partly entertainment. And splendor, what is splendor? Splendor can be, you're walking to wherever you're walking and you hear those birds. That's right. That's splendor enough. In fact, maybe what I'll do, maybe I'll read you one more of Taha's poems that deals with that, kind of not telling you about splendor, but embodying it. And remember that this is a man who lost everything, right? He lost his entire, not just his village, he lost his entire way of life in 1948. And he could have become an extremely embittered, violent, he could have been any number of things. But he became the most, maybe he already was, I don't know, but he became the most ebullient, sort of vital person I've ever encountered. So this is a poem called The Kid Goats of Jamil. Jamil is somebody in his village, maybe probably made up, probably some kind of composite. So I just read it. And the name of his village was Safaria, known for those of you who have Jewish knowledge. It's Safuri is the is Tzipori, where the Mishnah was codified. This is the same place, north, what is it? I guess a little north, east or west, I forget now, of Nazareth, but very close. Jamil, my father's cousin, our neighbor in Saphoria, married 3 wives, but had from them neither a son to inherit his name, nor a daughter to refresh his heart. Jamil, my father's cousin, our neighbor in Saphoria, owned a wide-eyed, long-haired, blonde Damascene she-goat that gave birth to 6 woolly kid goats 2 days after he returned from Mecca. It's Ramadan now. Still, their silken breath reminded you of the childhood of the world. Jamil's kid goats are creatures of another world. Jamil and his 3 wives' kid goats are 6 dough-smooth figures of dawn, 6 baby stars escaping the nursery of a star-filled sky. Their shadows won't stand still. Stones sleep. Satan sleeps. Shooting stars and fish sleep. But Jamil's kid goats never tire. The wind rests. Jamil's kid goats never grow drowsy. They scale the archway, leap over the log pile, scramble up to the roof's edge and run around in the courtyard, then down the path between the storeroom and the goat shed. Their frisky movements dissolve their coats' gay colors. Their craziness simply goes crazy on evenings when the almonds go green, and with the return of the harvest moon, the kid goats of Jamil and his wives leap out of the windows of their skin. They sway, pounce, and dance in the silvery fullness of the world like dangling lamps of mercury being tugged at by puppy-sized gin. The newly arrived kid goats filled the hearts of Jamil and his wives with a rare, buoyant splendor. They warmed their spirits and spilled soft as velvet into their home, into the goat shed and onto the path, perfuming the storeroom. That pleasure was never limited to the 3 wives. The gladness was never restricted to the blonde, wide-eyed, long-haired, golden-hearted Damascene she-goat. The happiness was never confined to Jamil, my father's cousin, our neighbor in Saphoria. A bright, hopeful joy spread out over the people, over the village, like the joy of the year's first rain. So, I mean, you know, there's a man who's writing about a world destroyed, the simplest things, and seeing splendor in, you know, what some people would consider a bunch of smelly goats. But, you know, for him, that was a world. So, in a very different vein, I wanted to read a poem by an Israeli Hebrew poet, Jewish poet, named Aaron Shabtai. He's still with us in his early 80s. To my mind, one of the great voices in world literature. It's a poem called The Prayer Book. He's about as anti-liturgical a person as you could get. He's known in Israel as he's the major translator of Greek drama into Hebrew. And he's the bad boy of Israeli literature. So it goes like this, The Prayer Book. For years, I've wanted to write a prayer book. Why? Because I've learned that the solid hangs upon nothingness. Because I've found that the sentence is a kind of petition. And because I found that in all that I've said, I've said only thank you. So little by little, in fact, I've written that book. And today it weighs some 200 pounds. And soon it will celebrate its 50th birthday. And yesterday, I bought it shoes. So, I mean, you know, there's a sense of, and this is a guy who's written some of the most brutal political poems in the history of the Middle East. But there's also the kind of gratitude of the given that I think is also. That addresses your splendor question, Justin. But
I think it does. Absolutely.
maybe, so just a couple more poems, we could take some questions. Another one of my favorite, well, here, I'll switch to, yeah, a woman named Leah Goldberg. She died 1960, no, maybe 67, something like that. Anyway, a mid-century poet born in, I think in Latvia, Lithuania, and then came to Palestine. And she's just a gorgeous, gorgeous poet. Was an important literary critic also. But I'll read a poem of hers. I'll read two poems of hers. One is a very late fragment, so it's a posthumous book. I'll read that, and then I'll just go from that into a poem called They've Gone. And it's about people who've departed, right? So also, again, pick that. So the fragment goes like this, the late fragment. In all we do, there's at least an eighth of a part of that. It isn't heavy. What easy secret grace we bear it with, wherever we go, through beautiful waking and walks and lovers' talk and into distraction. Forgotten deep in our being, it's with us always and isn't heavy. They've gone. They've gone on to their world, and that is all their world. But here my heart's devoured by hunger for this world, to hunger for its hunger, to be satisfied by its thirst, to grow within the growth of its seed and root, to love it now and now despise it, but to be within its ardor and its fear. That ending, you know, I mean, she wrote that just about a normal circumstance. But again, it seems to me very much about, you know, the world that's being taken away from maybe, or is being threatened, or our sense of the world. To love it now and now despise it, but to be within its ardor and its fear is a kind of goal, seemed to me really noble, amazing. Two late poems by a really amazing poet. Anything you want to say, Justin? I'll read a couple more poems and finish. And
Go ahead and read some poems. And if anyone has any questions, if they want to put them in the chat box, I think we can take them afterwards.
Okay. So I'll finish with two poems of my own. We've talked a little bit about influence tonight, and I've read you a range of poets that have influenced me in major ways. Really, I think, you know, major writers. And I talked to you about the sort of pleasures of influence and that kind of channeling. So this is a short poem that's about a similar kind of influence, maybe a simpler kind of influence, but in other ways a more unconscious, maybe more complex influence. It's called Being Led, L-E-D, and it's kind of a pun on L-E-A-D, you'll see. As I write, I'm being led by matter older than I am, but from the place where I was born. A yellow pencil on which the words, again the leader, 1946 Chevrolet, Patterson, New Jersey, have been engraved. The eraser, however, is less than useless. Using it only makes matters worse and blurs what appears on the page. It surfaced somehow not long ago. I found it among my father's papers. The pleasure it affords is strange. So that was just simply when my father died and I was going through his papers, I found this 1946 pencils from his grandfather. His father owned a Chevy dealership, or worked at a Chevy dealership. And I started writing with it, and it just sort of struck me how that's actually what I've been doing all along in my writing life, is kind of writing with a pencil that's channeling all kinds of other things. I see there was a question there. Should we take a question?
Yeah, and I think, Peter, this is a question I suspect you get all the time, which is, and you teach about this as well, what do you consider one of the greatest challenges in the act of being a translator of poetry? Not to put you on the spot.
Surviving. The greatest challenges, I tend to think, you can tell from the way I've been talking, I tend to think, first of all, of pleasures. What is the greatest pleasure, first of all, of translating? I think the greatest challenge is actually to keep your mind and keep your sort of writerly being on the place that's giving you pleasure. Because when you read a poem in another language, or in any language, but let's say you're reading a poem in a language that's not English, there's something that, and you like it, there's something that it makes the poem attach itself to you and makes you return to the poem. That casts a kind of spell over you. And spell in the same way that we mean spell, like use letters, right? The same word etymologically. Where is that spell coming from? What are those qualities in that poem that are getting you? So if you really care about that poem and that sort of complex pleasure that it's giving you, you attach yourself to it and you work to bring that same quality of a spell over into English. And that's a separate thing. It includes everything. It includes the meaning of the words and the associations and the cultural context and the rhythm and all that other stuff. But it's something that's bigger than any of those one thing. And often translators spend too much time thinking about the one-to-one things, and they atomize the experience of the poem. But for me, the point is to sort of keep your eye on the prize. What is that thing that cast its spell over you? Do everything you can in your poetic powers to bring it into English. You might leave a lot of other things out. That's okay. That's probably going to happen because you can't get everything. But if you got that thing that did it to you, you will probably transmit some of the magic that you felt. So, how you do that is, years of practice, genius, as Philip Larkin said, things like that. So,
well, Peter, do you want to give us maybe one more poem?
Okay, I will give you
whatever you're feeling.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to give us. It's a slightly more challenging poem, but Justin, in honor of our friend Maria Menokal, I'm going to read a poem that I wrote for her, and I wrote it about Worcester Square Park. And I wrote about Worcester Square Park, not just in the spring. I wrote it in the spring, but it really was about Worcester Square Park through the seasons. And it is very much about all the things I've been talking about, how our moment heightens a certain kind of consciousness of very, very basic things. I wrote it while she was very sick. Adina and I ran into her one day on a bench in Worcester Square, and she was just kind of sitting there and talking to us, but going through an extremely difficult time. So it is a little bit of a challenge to listen to this. It's not long, but it's a page and a half. And basically, for those of you who have been to Worcester Square or remember it, it's got all these wonderful interlocking paths, and that kind of interlocking patterns of the park and the way in which all the trees up on top connect. It's really a poem about the ramifying connectivity. And there's a lot of different trees that are in the park also. And it's called What Is, for MRM in Memoriam. The Norway maple's chartreuse crown, in April ciphers autumn's flares, startling with mace-like spikelets of flowers swelling over the paths of that square where we wander, adrift in the branching, or is it what's branching adrift in us? wafted as if afloat on a wisdom flowing through this city forest. The grid encodes an understanding. Those who stroll past tines of elms, who wade beneath the shade of summer's linden and trace the mottled bark of plains, move as though of their own accord, but under invisible gates of a grace, born in their being borne along, or gradually dying to the spell of the place, where dogs are walked and judgment is rendered, and power as weakness brings down limbs, where mercy's continual averment is tendered, and children at recess dart into rings, where a woman's will surges through her, sitting alone in the rinse of her cancer, as the vapor of chatters released to the air. All part of the terrible splendor. The weeping cherry shedding petals like snow in an ancient ocular rhyme. The sight, of course, is a sight of convention, the tiniest of triumphs over time. And yet, somehow, the saraband combines as majesty. The rupture and gentle carriage of kindness, the wind's extended winding kiss, the almost now actual. A marriage not so much of opposites as, say, analogous aspects, exits to entrances, or attics holding an axial weave of sound's foundation. The praxis perfecting opens into an instant's happiness, putting us back in the business of funneling the whole shebang, which Kabbalists have given a name: kingdom. What is? So, on that note, thank you all for listening and for your questions.
And Peter, thank you so much for joining us tonight and for giving us an opportunity to find splendor on a Friday evening. We're so grateful.
My pleasure. Thank you all. Bye.